Greetings! We have arrived to the wedding at Cana at last. So that's where we're starting. Cana, situated on the west side of a hill, was a clean, pleasant place, not so large as Capernaum, and had a synagogue to which were attached 3 priests. Near it was the public house at which the wedding was to be held. It had a forecourt planted with trees and shrubs. From this house to the synagogue, the street was adorned with leafy festoons and arches from which hung garlands and fruits. The festal hall extended from the entrance of the house back to beyond the fireplace, a high wall with ledges in it, which was now adorned like an altar with vases and flowers and gifts for the bride. Almost a third of this spacious hall was behind the fireplace, and there the women sat at the wedding banquet. The beams supporting the upper story were likewise hung with garlands, and there were means of ascent in order to light the lamps fastened to them. Subtext: Monday, December 26, 29 AD. We are Tebeth the 2nd today. When Jesus with his disciples arrived near Cana, he was most deferentially received by Mary, the bride's parents, the bridegroom, and others that had come out to meet him. Jesus, with his familiar disciples, among them the future apostles, took up his abode in an isolated house belonging to the maternal aunt of the bridegroom. This aunt also was a daughter of Anne's sister Sobe. She held the mother's place to the bridegroom during the wedding ceremonies. The bride's father was named Israel and was a descendant of Ruth of Bethlehem. He was an opulent merchant who carried on a large freighting business. He owned warehouses and great inns and storing places along the high roads for supplying caravans with fodder. His employees were numerous, for most of the inhabitants of Cana earned their living by working for him. In fact, all business transactions were wholly in the hands of himself and a few others. The bride's mother was a little lame. She limped on one side and had to be led. Subtext: Tuesday, December 27th. All the relatives of St. Anne and Joachim had come from around Galilee to Cana. In all, over 100 guests. Mary Mark, John Mark, Obed, and Veronica had come from Jerusalem. Jesus himself brought about 25 of his disciples with him. Long ago had Jesus, in his 12th year, at the children's feast held at the house of St. Anne upon his return from the temple, addressed to the bridegroom words full of mysterious significance on the subject of bread and wine. He had told him that at some future day he would be present at his marriage. Jesus' participation in this marriage, like every other action of his earthly career, had, besides its high mysterious signification, its exterior, apparent, and ordinary motives. More than once had Mary sent messengers to Jesus begging him to be present at it. The friends and relatives of the Holy Family, judging from a human view, were making such speeches as these: Mary, the mother of Jesus, is a lone widow. Jesus is roaming the country, caring little for her or his relatives, etc., etc. It was on this account, therefore, that Mary was anxious that her son should honor his friends by his presence at the marriage. Jesus entered into Mary's views and looked upon the present as a fitting opportunity to disabuse them of their erroneous ideas. He undertook also to supply one course of the feast. And so Mary went to Cana before the other guests and helped in the various preparations. Jesus had engaged to supply all the wine for the feast. Wherefore it was that Mary so anxiously reminded him that the wine failed. Jesus had also invited Lazarus and Martha to Cana. Martha assisted with Mary in the preparations, and it was Lazarus who defrayed, a circumstance known only to Jesus and Mary, all the expenses assumed by Jesus at the feast. Jesus had great confidence in Lazarus and willingly received everything from him, while Lazarus was only too happy to give to Jesus. He was up to the last like the treasurer of the community. During the whole feast, he was treated by the bride's father as a person of special distinction, and he even personally busied himself in his service. Lazarus was very refined in his manners, his whole demeanor earnest, quiet, and marked by a dignified affability. He spoke little, and his bearing toward Jesus was full of loving devotedness. Besides the wine, Jesus had also engaged to supply one course of the banquet, which course consisted of the principal dishes, such as birds of all kinds, fruits, and vegetables. For all these provision had been made. Veronica had brought with her from Jerusalem a basket of the choicest flowers and the most skillfully made confections. Jesus was like the master of the feast. He conducted all the amusements, which he seasoned with his own instructions. He it was, too, who arranged the whole order of the wedding ceremonies. He directed that all guests should amuse themselves on those days according to the customs usual on such occasions, but at the same time draw some lesson of wisdom from their various enjoyments. Among other things, he ordered that twice in the day the guests should leave the house to amuse themselves in the open air. Then I saw the wedding guests in a garden, the men and women separate, amusing themselves with conversation and games. The men reclined in circles on the ground. In the center were all kinds of fruit which, according to certain rules, they threw at one another. The thrower aimed at making it fall into certain holes or circles, while the other sought to prevent its doing so. I saw Jesus with cheerful gravity taking part in the game. Frequently, he smilingly uttered a word of wisdom that made his hearers wonder. Deeply impressed, they received it in silence, the less quick to perceive its meaning, asking for an explanation from their neighbor. Jesus had the inner circle and decided the prizes, which he awarded with beautiful and sometimes quite astonishing remarks. The younger of the guests amused themselves by running and leaping over leafy festoons and heaps of fruit. The women sat apart and played also for fruit, the bride's seat being always between Mary and the bridegroom's aunt. There was also performed a kind of dance. Children played on musical instruments and sang choruses at intervals. The dancers, both the men and the maidens, held scarves with which they touched one another when dancing in rows or in rings. Without these scarves, they never touched one another. Those of the bride and bridegrooms were black, the others were yellow. At first, the bride and bridegroom danced alone. Then all danced together. The maidens wore veils, but partly raised over the face. The dresses were long in the back, but a little raised in the front by means of laces. There was no leaping nor springing in the dance as is customary among us. It was more of a moving in all kinds of figures, accompanied by frequent swayings of the person and keeping time to the music with the hands, the head, and the whole body. Though perfectly modest and graceful, it reminded me of that swaying of the Pharisaical Jews at prayer. None of the future apostles took part in the dance, but Nathanael, Chased, Obed, Jonathan, and some others of the disciples entered into it. The female dancers were the maidens only. The order observed was quite extraordinary, and a spirit of tranquil joyousness prevailed among the guests. During those days of rejoicing, Jesus had frequently private interviews with those disciples that were later on to become his apostles. But the others were not neglected. Jesus often walked with them and with the other guests in the country around and instructed them. The future apostles often explained Jesus' teaching to their companions. This going abroad of the guests facilitated the preparations for the feast indoors. Several of the disciples, however, and even Jesus himself at times, were present at the preparations going on in the house, helping to arrange this or that, and besides, several of them had a part in bridal procession. Jesus intended to manifest himself at this feast to all his friends and relatives. He wished also that all whom he had chosen up to the present should become known to one another and to his own relatives. This could be done with greater freedom on such an occasion as this marriage festival. Jesus taught likewise in the synagogue before the guests and assembled there. He spoke of the enjoyment of lawful pleasures, of the motives through which they might be indulged, and of the moderation and prudent reserve that ought to accompany them. Then he spoke of marriage, of husband and wife, of continence, of chastity, and of spiritual unions. At the close of this instruction, the bridal pair stepped out in front of Jesus, and he addressed each separately. Subtext: the nuptial ceremony, the woman's game, the men's lottery. Wednesday, December 28th, 29 AD. We are now Tebeth IV. On the third day after Jesus' arrival at about 9 o'clock in the morning, the marriage ceremony was performed. The bride had been adorned by her bridesmaids. Her dress was something like that worn by the Mother of God at her espousals. Her crown, too, was similar, though more richly ornamented, but her hair was not netted in strands so fine as was that of Mary. The braids were fewer and thicker. When fully attired, she was presented to the Blessed Virgin and the other women. The bride and bridegroom were conducted processionally from the house of festivity to the synagogue and back again. 6 little boys and as many little girls with garlands and wreaths headed the procession. Then came 6 larger boys and 6 larger girls with flutes and other musical instruments. On their shoulders stood out some kind of stiff material like wings. 12 young maidens accompanied the bride as bridesmaids, and the same number of youths, the bridegroom. Among the latter were Obed, Veronica's son, Joseph of Arimathea's nephews, Nathanael chastened, and some of John's disciples, but none of the future apostles. The nuptial ceremony was performed by the priest in front of the synagogue. The rings exchanged by the young pair had been presented to the bridegroom by Mary after Jesus had blessed them for her. I remarked something at this marriage that has escaped me at the nuptials of Joseph and Mary. That is, the priest pierced the left ring finger of both bridegroom and bride with a sharp instrument just at the place where the ring was to be worn. Then he caught in a glass of wine 2 drops of blood from the bridegroom and 1 from the bride. The contents of the glass the young couple then drank in common and afterward gave away the glass. After this, many other articles such as scarfs and other pieces of clothing were bestowed upon the poor gathered around. When the bridal pair were reconducted to the festal house, Jesus himself received them. Before the wedding banquet, I saw all the guests again assembled in the garden. The women and maidens sat on a carpet in an arbor and played for fruit. They passed from one to another a little triangular tablet, on the edge of which were inscribed certain letters, and which was provided also with an index. The tablet was rested on the lap, the index twirled, and the point over which it paused determined the prizes. But for the amusement of the men, I beheld a wonderful game contrived by Jesus himself in the summer house. In the center of the house stood a round table with as many portions of flowers, leaves, and fruits placed around the edge as there were players. Jesus had, beforehand and alone, arranged these portions, each with reference to some mysterious signification. Above the surface of the table was a movable disc with a slot in it. The portion of the fruit or flowers over which the slot rested when the disc was revolved became the prize of him who had turned it. In the center of the table, a vine branch laden with grapes rose out of the bundle of ears and wheat. The longer the disc was turned, the higher rose the grapes and wheat. Neither the future apostles nor Lazarus took part in the game. I was told at the time that whoever had received a call to teach or was to be favored with greater knowledge than his companions should not engage in the game. He should watch the results and be ready to season them with instructive applications. Thus would gravity and hilarity mutually temper each other. In this game arranged by Jesus, there was something very wonderful and more than fortuitous. For the prize that fell to the players severally was significant of his own individual inclinations, faults, and virtues. This Jesus explained to each as the prize he had won was assigned him. Each prize was, as it were, a parable, a similitude upon the winner himself. And I felt with the fruit he actually received something interiorly. All were touched and animated by the words of Jesus, perhaps also by the partaking of the fruit, whose significant properties were now producing their effect. What Jesus said about each prize was quite unintelligible to all that it did not concern. It was received by the bystanders as only a pleasant, pointed remark, but each felt that the Lord had cast a deeply penetrating glance into his own interior. The same thing happened here as at Jesus' words to Nathanael relative to that gazing under the fig tree. They had sunk deep into Nathanael's soul, while from the others their meaning remained hidden. I remember even yet that mignonette was one among the flowers, and that Jesus, when awarding his prize to Nathanael Chancellor, said to him, "Now canst thou understand that I was right in saying to thee, thou art a true Israelite in whom there is no guile." I saw one of the prizes producing most wonderful effects. Nathanael, the bridegroom, won a remarkable piece of fruit. Just a side note, there's a Nathanael Chased and a Nathanael the bridegroom. They're different people. Okay. There were two pieces on a single stem. One was like a fig, the other, which was hollow, more like a ribbed apple. They were of a reddish color, the inside white and streaked with red. I've seen similar in paradise. I perceived that the bystanders were very much surprised when the bridegroom won that fruit, and that Jesus spoke of marriage and of chastity, and dwelt upon the hundredfold fruit of the latter. And yet in all that Jesus said on these subjects, there was nothing that could shock the Jewish ideas on the score of marriage. Some of the Essene disciples, James the Less for instance, comprehended better than the others the deep significance of his words. I saw that the guests wondered over that prize than over many others, and I heard Jesus saying that those fruits could produce effects far greater than was the remarkable signification attached to them. After the bridegroom and bride had eaten the fruit they had won, I saw the former become very much agitated. He grew pale, and a dark vapor escaped from him, after which he looked to me much brighter and purer, yes, even transparent when compared with what he had been before. The bride, too, who at a distance was sitting among the women, became, after eating her piece of fruit, quite faint. A dark shadow appeared to go out from her. The fruit that the bridal pair ate bore some reference to chastity. There were certain penances connected with the different prizes. I remember seeing both the bride and bridegroom bringing something away from the synagogue and performing certain devotions. Nathaniel Chassid's prize was a little bunch of sorrel. In each of the other disciples were awoke after eating their prizes his predominant passion. It struggled a little for the mastery and then either departed or the possessor became by the combat strengthened against its assault. The vegetable kingdom before the fall was endowed with a certain supernatural virtues, but since the taint of sin, the power of plants remains for man a secret. The form, the taste, the effects of various herbs and fruits are now but simple vestiges of the virtues they possessed before sin touched them. In my visions, I have seen upon the celestial tables fruits such as they were before the fall, but their peculiar attributes were not always quite clear to me. Such things appear confused to our darkened understanding, rendered even more obtuse by the customs of ordinary life. When the bride fainted, her attendants relieved her of some of her heaviest ornaments. From her fingers they drew several of her numerous rings. Among them was a gold funnel-shaped shield worn like a thimble in the middle finger. They removed also the brackets and chains from her arms and breast. The only ornament she retained besides the marriage ring, which the Blessed Virgin had given, was a gold pendant from the neck. It was in shape something like an oblong arc, on the plane of which was inlaid something in brown like that of the wedding ring of Mary and Joseph. On that brown ground reclined a figure attentively considering a flower bud which it held in its hand. The game in the garden was followed by the nuptial banquet. That part of the spacious hall of the festal house on this side of the adorned fireplace was divided into 3 places or spaces by 2 movable screens so low that the guests reclining at each different table could see one another. In each of these compartments was a long narrow table. Jesus reclined at the head of the middle one, his feet toward the fireplace. At the same table sat Israel, the bride's father, Lazarus, and the male relatives of Jesus and those of the bride. The other wedding guests, along with the disciples, sat at the 2 side tables. The women sat in space back of the fireplace, but where they could hear all that Jesus said. The bridegroom served at table, assisted by the steward, who wore an apron, and by several servants. The women were waited upon by the bride and some maidservants. When the dishes of food were brought in, a roasted lamb, the feet bound crosswise, was set before Jesus. When the bridegroom brought to Jesus the little case in which lay the carving knife, Jesus bade him recall that children's entertainment after the Passover feast, at which he had related the parable of a marriage, and had foretold to him that he would be present at his, the bridegroom's, marriage. The words were intended for Nathanael alone, Nathanael the bridegroom, that is. On hearing them, he became very thoughtful, for he had quite forgotten the circumstance. Jesus was at the banquet as he had been during the whole celebration, very cheerful and always ready with a word of instruction. He accompanied every action with an explanation of its spiritual signification and spoke of hilarity and the enjoyment of the feast. He remarked that the bow must not always be bent, that the field must sometimes be refreshed by rain, and upon each he uttered a parable. As he carved the lamb, most wonderful words fell from his lips. He spoke of separating the lambs from the flocks, not for the greater advantage of the little animals thus chosen, but that they should die. Then he alluded to the process of roasting, in which the meat was divested of its rawness by the fire of purification. The carving of each member signified, as he said, the manner in which they who would follow the Lamb should separate from their nearest relatives according to the flesh. When to each one he had reached a peace and all were partaking of it, he said that the lamb had been separated from its companions and cut into pieces, that it might become in them a nourishment of mutual union. So too must he that would follow the Lamb renounce his own field of pasture, put his passions to death, and separate from the members of his family. Then would he become, as it were, a nourishment, a food, to unite by means of the Lamb his fellow men to the heavenly Father. Before every guest was a plate or a little wheaten cake. Jesus set down a dark brown plate with a yellow rim before himself, and it was afterward handed around. I saw him at times holding up a little bunch of herbs in his hand and giving some instruction upon it. Jesus had engaged to supply the second course of the banquet as well as the wine, and for all this his mother and Martha provided. The second course consisted of birds, fish, honey confections, fruits, and a kind of pastry which Veronica had brought with her. When it was all carried in and set on a side table, Jesus arose, gave the first cut to each dish, and then resumed his place at table. The dishes were served, but the wine failed. Jesus, meanwhile, was busy teaching. Now, when the Blessed Virgin, who had provided for this part of the entertainment, saw that the wine failed, she said to Jesus and reminded him that he had told her that he would see to the wine. Jesus, who was teaching of his heavenly Father, replied, "Woman, be not solicitous. Trouble not thyself and me. My hour is not yet come." These words were not uttered in harshness to the Blessed Virgin. Jesus addressed her as woman and not as mother, because at this moment as the Messiah, as the Son of God, he was present in divine power and was about to perform in presence of all his disciples and relatives an action full of mystery. On all occasions, when he acted as the incarnate Word, he ennobled those that participated in the same by giving them the title that best responded to the part assigned them. Thus did the holiness of the divine action shed, as it were, some rays upon them and communicate to them a special dignity. Mary was the woman who had brought forth him whom now, as her creator, she invokes on the occasion of the wine's failing. As the creator, he will now give a proof of his high dignity. He will here show that he is the Son of God and not the Son of Mary. Later on, when dying upon the cross, he again addressed this weeping mother by the appellation of woman. Woman, behold thy son, thereby designating John. Jesus had promised his mother that he would provide the wine. And here we see Mary beginning the role of mediatrix that she has ever since continued. She places before him the failure of the wine, but the wine that he was about to provide was more than ordinary wine. It was symbolical of that mystery by which he would one day change wine into his own blood. The reply, "My hour is not yet come," contained three significations. First, the hour for supplying the promised wine. Secondly, the hour for changing water into wine. Thirdly, the hour for changing wine into his own blood. But Mary's anxiety for the wedding guests was now entirely relieved. She had mentioned the matter to her son, therefore she says confidently to the servants, "Do all that he shall tell you." In like manner does the church, the bride of Jesus, say to him, "Lord, thy children have no wine." And Jesus replies, "Church," not bride, "be not troubled, be not disquieted. My hour is not yet come." Then the church says to her priests, "Hearken to his words, obey all his commands, for he will always help you." Mary told the servants to await the commands of Jesus and fulfill them. After a little while, Jesus directed them to bring him the empty jugs and turn them upside down. The jugs were brought, 3 water jugs and 3 wine jugs. And that they were empty was proved by inverting them over a basin. Then Jesus ordered each to be filled with water. The servants took them off to the well, which was in a vault in the cellar, and which consisted of a stone cistern provided with a pump. The jugs were earthen, large and so heavy that, when full, it took 2 men to carry them, one at each handle. They were pierced at intervals from top to bottom by tubes closed by faucets. When the contents to a certain depth were exhausted, the next lower faucet opened to pour out. They were only tipped up on their high feet. Mary's words to Jesus had been uttered in a low tone, but Jesus' reply, as well as his command to draw water, was given in a loud voice. When the jugs filled with water had been placed, 6 in number, on the side table, Jesus went and blessed them. As he retook his place at table, he called to his servant, "Draw off now, and bring a drink to the steward." When this latter had tasted the wine, he approached the bridegroom and said, "Every man at first setteth forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now." He did not know that the wine was provided by Jesus, as was also this whole course of the feast. That was a secret between the Holy Family and the family of the bridal pair. Then the bridegroom and the bride's father drank of the wine, and great was their astonishment. The servants protested that they had drawn only water, and that the drinking vessels and glasses on the table had been filled with the same. And now the whole company drank. The miracle gave rise to no alarm or excitement. On the contrary, a spirit of silent awe and reverence fell upon them. Jesus taught much upon this miracle. Among other things, he said that the world presents the strong wine first and then deceives the partially intoxicated with bad drinks. But it was not so in the kingdom that his heavenly Father had given him. There, pure water was changed to costly wine, as lukewarmness should give place to ardor and intrepid zeal. He alluded also to that banquet at which in his 12th year, after his return from teaching in the temple, he had been present with many of the guests now assembled, and who were then mere boys. He reminded them that he had on that occasion spoken of bread and wine, and had related the parable of a marriage at which the water of tepidity would be changed into the wine of enthusiasm. This, he said, was now fulfilled. He told them that they should witness greater miracles than this, that he would celebrate several Passovers, and at the last would change wine into blood and bread into flesh, and that he would remain with them till the end to strengthen and console. After that meal, they should see happen to him things that they could not now understand, even were he to explain them. Jesus did not say this all in plain terms. He hid it under parables, which I have forgotten, though I have given their sense. His listeners were filled with fear and wonder, and the wine produced a change in all. I saw that not by the miracle alone, but also by the drinking of that wine, each one had received strength, true and interior. Each had become changed. This change was similar to that wrought in them at an earlier stage in his entertainment by eating of the fruit. His disciples, his relatives, in a word, all present were now convinced of Jesus' power and dignity, as well as of his mission. All believed in him. Faith at once took possession of every heart. All became better, more united, more interior. The same effect was produced in all that had drunk of the wine. Jesus, at this wedding feast, was, as it were, in the midst of his community for the first time. There it was that he wrought that first miracle in their favor and for the confirmation of their faith. It is on that account that his miracle, this miracle, the changing of water into wine, is recorded as the first in his history, as that of the Last Supper, when his apostles were staunch in the faith, was the last. At the close of the banquet, the bridegroom went to Jesus and spoke to him very humbly in private. He told him that he now felt himself dead to all carnal desires, and that, if his bride would consent, he would embrace a life of continence. The bride also, having sought Jesus alone and expressed her wish to the same effect, Jesus called them both before him. He spoke to them of marriage, of chastity so pleasing to the sight of God, and of the hundredfold fruit of the Spirit. He referred to many of the prophets and other holy persons who had lived in chastity, offering their bodies as a holocaust to the Heavenly Father. They had thus reclaimed many wandering souls and had won them to themselves as so many spiritual children, and had acquired a numerous and holy posterity. Jesus spoke all this in parables of sowing and reaping. The young couple took a vow of continence, by which they bound themselves to live as brother and sister for the space of 3 years. They knelt before Jesus, and he blessed them. Subtext: Thursday, December 29. On the evening of the 4th day of the marriage, the bride and bridegroom were conducted to their home in festal procession. Lights arranged so as to form a letter were carried. Children went before, carrying on strips of cloth 2 wreaths of flowers, an open one and a closed one, which they tore to pieces and scattered around the front of the house of the newly married couple. Jesus had gone on ahead. He received them at the house and blessed them. The priests also were present. Since the miracle wrought by Jesus at the banquet, they had become very humble and gave him precedence everywhere. Subtext: Saturday, December 31st. We're at Tebeth the 7th, and we skipped over Friday because it was just italicized narrative. On the Sabbath spent at Cana, Jesus taught twice in the synagogue. He alluded to the wedding feast and to the obedience and pious sentiments of the bridal couple. On leaving the synagogue, he was accosted by the people, who threw themselves at his feet and implored him to cure their sick. Jesus performed here 2 wonderful cures. A man had fallen from a high tower. He was taken up dead, all his limbs broken. Jesus went to him, placed the limbs in position, touched the fractures, and then commanded the man to rise and go to his home. The man arose, thanked Jesus, and went home. He had a wife and children. Jesus was next conducted to a man possessed by the devil, and whom he found chained to a great stone. Jesus freed him. He was next led to a woman, a sinner, who was afflicted by an issue of blood. He cured her, as also some others sick of edema. He healed 7 in all. The people had not dared to crowd around him during the marriage festivities, but now that it was rumored that he was going away after the Sabbath, they could no longer be restrained. Since the miracle of the marriage feast, the priests did not interfere with Jesus. They allowed him to do all that he had wished. The miracles, the cures just related, happened in their presence alone, for the disciples were not there. And here's where I conclude the reading, because the next subtext starts here. That is not a day subtext, but he goes around Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee. All right, so a few notes. The first one, 25 disciples. I hope you've been following along. Of the 12, I think that there were the 3 sons of Mary Cleophas, Jude, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and James the Less are with him. And you have Philip, and I don't know, she said during the text that none of the 12 were there, but she mentioned Nathaniel Chassid was there, and maybe Nathaniel's not one of the 12. So anyways, Andrew and Simon Peter, and then John. I always thought like Nathaniel is Bartholomew or something like that, and it was just like a second name, but I guess that's that. Anyways, I don't know if they were all with him. That is these Simon, Peter, and Andrew and all them, but I know John was probably there because he's the one that wrote it. The others not here, obviously, are Judas Iscariot, Bartholomew, Matthew, Levi, and probably James. I don't think James is mentioned yet. That's the other, the brother of John, James of Zebedee. Anyways, let's continue. Mary called Jesus to correct the bad-mouthing. Now, Jesus was getting a bad reputation for not taking care of his mother. People always complaining about something. Again, though we consider it pharisaical to complain that Mary is not being taken care of by her son, who's on ministry. It's the same kind of people who say, I can't believe that Simon Peter would leave his children and wife behind. I won't explain that now because there's more to that, but people always have to understand by now that good is well ordered. And to argue with what is good, you need to have something to argue with. If you've come up with your own concept of good, you argue with good, then you've joined the side of evil. Good is one, and good is true. There's only one relationship one can possibly have with what is good, and that's a listening one. There is no dialogue. You ask it questions and it answers. However, if you complain to it, you are declaring hostility. Knowing Mary as much as any mortal can know the pinnacle of creation, we can probably assume that she wanted Jesus to have as good a reputation as possible. So she's trying to protect that. And she understood more than anyone else that he had great things to accomplish on his ministry, although he always had her in mind. Obviously, there's a pretty special moment that happens between the two of them here. Next note, when Jesus was cutting up the lamb, he foreboded, obviously, what was going to become of the disciples. That they were basically sacrificing their lives or denying themselves for the sake of this quote-unquote feast. Now, this feast, this wedding feast he's at, is obviously an allusion, that's Alluision or whatever, Usion, anyways, allusion to the great feast, the heaven feast, right? the Feast of the Lamb. He used this occasion and all the similitude that came from it as a prep course for his disciples, and we can, in partaking of this special reading of this extremely powerful passage, assume that priests should also take the similar prep course. Now, what's funny about this is that I'm reminded of a docuseries I watched about World War II called The World at War. And they use part of an episode, or maybe a full one, to describe Japanese soldiers. I know it's an odd anecdote, but stick with me. Now, these Japanese soldiers had all surrendered their lives to the emperor. They were now dead, effectively dead. When you give yourself to the military of Japan, you are now dead. And it's like the same thing with priests. This is why Japanese soldiers would suicide themselves in their fight against the Allies. They'd pull the grenade and then they'd go jump into people, or pull the pin from the grenade, or they'd crash their planes purposely in the infrastructure or battleships or whatnot. And we all know the kamikaze strategy. And this is also why, and they were brutal in this. And when I say brutal, understand me. When they took prisoners of war from Britain, they would basically take them to work them to death of heat exhaustion or starvation, as they had those British soldiers build their infrastructure. There was no surrender to them. And by the way, I highly recommend this series. There's also another series. I won't mention it here because YouTube might not like that. Let's just call it The Story Never Told, Greatest Never. Anyways, but I recommend that side of it because people should see both sides of the tale. The Germans especially have their side of the tale. Anyways, so when it comes to the priesthood, you can back out of the game and become laicized. But in general, when one swears an oath of this sort, they should consider that they let part of themselves die. Some might say, well, if this is true, who's going to become a priest? The truth? More than are becoming priests now. Men, I know this may come as a shock to some people, but men are attracted to noble causes. They want to die for goodness because they want to know that their lives are worth something, which is why traditional seminaries will never lose their numbers, because the eternal cause of the apostleship is a special fantasy that many men not only have, but perhaps the calling they feel to become a priest in the first place. The more the Novus Ordo seminaries have eroded at this special fantasy, the less appealing was it to become a priest that merely says on a pulpit or at the pulpit, not words of nobility and sacrifice to the cause of being a man and doing one's duty, but rather words of sharing and caring and friendship and being a good neighbor. And this doesn't appeal much to men at all, unfortunately, because they're passive words. They don't imbue men with any sense of special self-worth. People want to fight to the death because this is immortal life. We're fighting demons. You will attract as many soldiers to your cause if you raise the stakes. The military knows this. That's why they hyperbolize their causes. However, the true cause is the cause of the church. Here, the stakes are always high. You're fighting against demons. Here, Christ raises the stakes for his apostles when he's cutting up the lamb. And this is probably where he sort of separates the 12 from the outer 72, although they weren't all present. Next note, and this one's a very important one. Woman. I have some extra notes on this matter. There is a contested apparition, but everybody knows that I think it's authentic. In English, it's called Our Lady of All Nations, but if you translate the title, it's actually the Woman of All Peoples. And I marked this because the use of the word woman in the real icon of it, you see the words are de Frauen, something Völkerin. And anyways, the Frauen means woman, not Our Lady. It's the woman of all peoples. So I marked this only because of the use of the word woman. It's supposed to be woman, not Our Lady here, but woman of all. In the Gospel of John, he uses this title 3 times, 2 for Mary and 1 in John 8 when he addresses the sitting woman and says to her, "Woman, have they not condemned you? Then I do not condemn you either. Go and sin no more." And Catherine references the 2 addressing his mother in the text. That is, when he says woman. When he uses this title, I had long espoused before in Catherine's explanation exactly what she meant, because in studying the Woman of All Peoples apparition, I found a lot of literary value in many of the messages. This is one of the reasons I loved reading the gospel in the first place. And I am a critic. I'm a man who enjoys really good truffle chocolates from Belgium and spends $20 for 10 pieces. Because I discern books in the same way. I love a good novel that is rich in literary tropes. The Woman of All Peoples messages had a lot of tropes, and you could link each message to the liturgical date. The date of each message to the liturgical calendar and find out extra signification. For example, I think the first message happened on the day Jesus was conceived, the Annunciation. The woman itself, and keep in mind, it pushes this message from Amsterdam, pushes the final Marian dogma that she be declared mediatrix of all graces, co-redemptrix, and advocate, as connected and was always connected to John 2, the wedding. Woman is the address that Adam gives his wife. She was not originally called Eve. That came after the fall. There's a reason for that. But she was called woman at first. This was explained by an old priest, in an old video by a priest on a show you find on YouTube. I actually have a list of them on. I don't know if it's on this channel or my other one, but anyways, it's called "What Catholics Believe." It's the old blue ones. There's new ones, but I don't. That priest is hard to listen to. Anyways. The old ones were kind of hardcore, and I respect their position in these confusing times. Anyways, at least they taught the orthodoxy. You don't agree with them on everything, but they taught the orthodoxy. And one of them had taught, the priests that is, had taught that Adam was naming everything because he was above everything. Humans are the steward of the earth, right? So when the woman was brought before him, rather than naming her, which marked her as a lesser, he called her woman as a term of adoration, because she was, quote, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, unquote. It was not quite that she was her equal, but more that he wanted her to share with him the kingdom, because he loved her. Jesus calls Mary woman in this special way. He's speaking as the divine man, yes. He's also speaking as the new first man, or Adam, addressing the new first woman, and we call her the new Eve, but she's the new woman, because Eve is the name of the fallen woman after Adam was given dominion over her as part of the punishment of Genesis 3. Now, woman, that is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, what has this to do with me? For my hour is not yet come. It comes full circle that the apparitions I mention, that is the woman of all nations in Amsterdam, wants Mary to be declared mediatrix in the final Marian dogma, and that Anne Catherine specifically uses this title in the text concerning the title woman. That she says she's acting as intercessor or mediatrix here. Although she doesn't say mediatrix of all graces, but when she says mediatrix, it is the one mediator. Here you should probably get, and there's a lot of Protestants that complain, Jesus is our only mediator. Yeah, but your only mediator to Jesus is Mary, actually. So, yeah. Oh, well, that's not possible. Yeah, it is. See, if you get anything from Christ, it comes through Mary. This is why we call her the mediatrix of all graces. If we get anything throughout all of this existence, any graces at all, it comes through Mary. And this was in Mystical City of God. Actually, if you want a really good Easter reading, you should read these passages in the third volume called the Transfixation, is it called? Something like that. But anyways, near the end of it, I'd say not the last few chapters, but near the end of the volume 3, you will have the chapters of his crucifixion, and they are by far her longest and most detailed ones. Obviously, she wrote a lot on his passion, especially concerning the workings of Satan. So, when he was on the cross, he made his 7 final declarations, and she has a special chapter dedicated to that, in which he essentially, and she explains it, anoints Mary and allows her to inherit everything as he goes back to his Father. So yes, she's in charge. So anyways, Anne Catherine was connect on all 3 significations in the text. I mean, obviously she is. She knows more than I do. But anyways, what I was trying to say is Christ's hour was obviously his passion, where he would turn his blood into the new wine, which does not go into the old wineskin, which is a parable he made in one of his other gospels. And the old wineskin references the Mosaic faith, but new wine goes into new wineskin, which is Catholicism. When I studied the gospel, I quickly equated wine to being his passion, and wine and blood being used in relation to one another as a type. Now, the bride and bridegroom swore this is another note, and this is just like a little end note. The bride and bridegroom swore a 3-year vow of continence, which is interesting. That happens to be the length of Christ's ministry. I wonder if they're involved. But anyways, in case there was confusion in the text, there's Nathaniel the bridegroom and Nathaniel Chassid, and they're 2 different people. Anyways, the reason why these videos have come more slowly lately is because I have been writing another novel. And the plot, it just so happens, has 2 characters vowing continence to one another because they are on a mission. It just so happens. It's a nice coincidence, though. Anyways, that's it. Ave Maria.